Good evening, everybody. Um, Welcome to the first Essex Birdwatching Society indoor meeting of 2026. I'm hoping that everyone can hear us okay. Richard, I see you're online. Could you give me a thumbs up if that's all working fine? That's worrying. Just, yeah, I'm not sure that they can hear us at the moment, Ken. I'm just double checking that at the moment.
Okay.
So, can anyone let us know that they can hear us clearly? All right. Oh, good. Thank you very much. Okay. Yes, we've got confirmation. That's good. So this evening, we're welcoming Dr. Ken Smith. Ken spent his career in the RSPB in their Centre for Conservation Science, and during that time developed an extensive knowledge of lesser spotted woodpeckers. He's also a special advisor to the Rare Birds Breeding Panel in respect to the species, and is therefore somewhat a national authority on them. So, Ken, welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. We're really looking forward to this. So, I'm going to exit stage left and hand over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. Um, I think I last spoke about Lesser Spotted Woodpeckers in Essex in 2022, one of your one-day conferences, and I think it's pretty clear that we've actually learned a massive amount about them in the last few years to move things on. And if anything, our message on lesser spots has got far more positive, particularly in the last year, as to whether we can save the species in Britain. So what I'm going to do this evening is run through a lot of stuff on less spots, comparing it with great spots where we have to, and then in the end come back to some of the reasons why I think we have reason to be optimistic. So um, this is talk is joint with my wife. Between us, we run a thing called Woodpecker Network, which I'll explain about as we go through. But it's certainly kept the two of us busy in the last decade of our retirement. Right, moving on. Um, as you know, the Lesser Spotted Woodpecker is one of the most rapidly declining species in Britain. Um, it's declined so much that actually it's not all that well monitored anymore. But I pulled together here data from the BTO, um, mainly from the last atlas, 2008-11, which is the breeding distribution here on the left. The red dots are the 10-kilometre squares with less spots in. Um, and on the right here is the change since the previous atlases. So at that stage, there had been three atlases. BT are about to organise the fourth one, which is brilliant. But you can see on this change map, the black symbols, don't need to look at the details, but the black symbols are the 10-kilometre squares that had lost their lesser spotted woodpeckers um, sometime in the previous 20 or 40 years. And there's quite a pattern there that East Anglia seems to be doing very badly, and also a band through Middle England. But still lots of pink in Kent and Sussex, Sussex where I now live, into Hampshire and up the Welsh marches. Lesser spot used to be monitored by the Common Bird Census and the follow-on Breeding Bird Survey, and this is from the BTO website, their best graph of trend since then. And the thing that's notable is there was a big increase through the 70s, and then numbers crashed, and now it's right down here at 100. And if you ask Simon Gillings at the BTO who produces all this stuff, he'll agree that actually there's no power to detect any change anymore because the lesser spots are only reported from maybe at most 10 breeding bird survey sites in the whole country every year. So this index is bumbling along here at the bottom at 100, but we won't be able to really detect any change from that. This graph here on the right is a thing that my wife Linda did a few years ago, producing a population index based on ringing totals. This is the old BTO line, and it used to stop at 2,000, but they've now extended it. But what Linda did here was to pull out the number of lesser spotted woodpeckers ringed each year and divide it by a shopping basket of other woodland species to normalize it. And it shows the same pattern, really. A maximum in the 70s and then a big decline. We've got two black and white woodpeckers, as you know. So on the left there we have the great spot, and on the right we have the lesser spot. I've deliberately presented him like this because it's not like that at all, really. That's more like the situation. So the great spot is starling size. The lesser really is small, is only sparrow size. Characteristic differences: great spots always have some red on their undertail, very bright on these smart adults like this male here, male great spot with the red on the back of his head. They've always got some red there. Even the juveniles have a pale red there. Lessers have no red whatsoever there. As far as we're concerned, Woodpecker Network, the confusion is that the male lesser spotted woodpecker, this is one, has red on the top of its head. And very often through midsummer, people get woodpeckers coming to their garden feeders with red on the top of their head, and they look in the field guides, and the only woodpecker that's shown like that is a lesser spot, and what they're actually seeing is a juvenile great spot. But very few of the field guides actually illustrate the juvenile plumage, and that causes lots of fun and games over the summer. It'd be great if these were lesser spots coming to garden feeders, but in general they're great spots. As you know, great spot is one of the most rapidly increasing birds in Britain. Here's the distribution on the left. Contrast that with the lesser spot. This is just solid. And in the last 2 decades, great spots have actually colonized Ireland of their own accord. So numbers are so high in Britain that they're going across the Irish Sea and have become established over there. And I'm sure this map is now way out of date. There'll be far more records as they spread through Ireland. And they obviously used to be in Ireland, but they were lost many centuries ago when all the trees were removed. And that happened way back in Tudor times, and most of the trees got removed from Ireland. So solid, so many great spots that you can produce an abundance map, and they are most abundant across southern England, South Essex, through Kent, Sussex, Hampshire, up the Welsh Marches again. Interestingly, most abundant in the areas that still have lesser spots. And I'm sure that's because there's a lot of woodland cover in those areas. If you look at the population trend for great spot, it had an increase in the 70s, but then it stabilized right through the 90s and then shot up again and is at a really high level, index of 500s. That's gone up 5 times since the start of the index. But it's now flat, if not declining. And I would predict actually over the next decade, lesser spots will gradually go down in numbers for reasons that I might remember to explain later. But the interesting thing is if you take these 2 graphs, the lesser spot trend and the great spot, and fiddle about to get them on the same time axis, you can see that both species of woodpecker increase through the 70s. And those of you who have been around a long time, like I have, will remember that it was actually the Dutch elm disease outbreak in the 70s that led to an increase of both woodpecker species, and particularly the lesser spot. They were very common. They used to be quite common as hedgerow birds when hedgerows had trees in them, but a lot of those trees were elms, and as the elms died, there was a superabundance of bark beetles and bark beetle larvae that the woodpeckers fed on, and so they are everywhere. But But then after that, the lesser spot goes down and the great spot stayed pretty constant and then shot up. So Dutch elm disease was that cause. And at one stage, you could say, well, lesser spot had increased because of Dutch elm disease and was actually getting back to its more normal levels. The problem was that it got back to its more normal levels, but then carried on declining. So that's unfortunate. I'm just going to quickly say why we think great spots increased. So most of my work on woodpeckers was great spots, and we came up with really three drivers for that. The first on the right there is starlings, and that big increase through the 90s was the result of starling numbers declining because of changes in agriculture, and starlings are a nest site competitor for great spots, and starlings, believe it or not, can house great spots just like that. And so when I first started on woodpeckers in the 80s, loads of the great spot nests were lost to starlings. Starling numbers collapsed for farming reasons, and that, I'm sure, was one of the key drivers that kicked off that increase from the 90s onwards. And over here, garden feeding, great spot is very adaptable. I'm sure you all get them in your gardens, very quick to find food in gardens. So they've responded to that, and that must be a factor. And then the one at the bottom is a bit less obvious. Because of lack of management of most of our woodlands, there's actually been an increase in the volumes of dead wood, and particularly the sort of dead wood that great spots feed on. They forage for invertebrates on dead wood. They don't actually eat the wood. They're looking for beetle larvae, beetles, anything else that's living in there. And they forage typically on quite large diameter dead wood, and that's the sort of thing that's increased. We've got lots of data showing that's increased in the woodlands. Right. Back to lesser spots. I don't have an equivalent map like this for Essex, but this is the situation in Sussex where I now live. We now live down in this corner, almost in Hampshire, West Sussex. And you can see that great spot was, in the last atlas, was all over Sussex in large numbers, recording 900 of the tetrads in the county. Nearly 90% of the tetras have got them, whereas the lesser spot at the same period was only recorded in 6% and a few dotted around, and particularly in this northern area of the county, which is actually the Sussex Weald, a very poorly drained area of clays with lots and lots of woodland, big woodland cover. So tonight I'm going to use various sources of information. I studied woodpeckers in Hertfordshire, where we lived from 84 to 2016 when we moved away. So that was a really long running study. Some on lesser spots, but mainly great spots. When I was still working for the RSPB and lesser spot was declining, we got funding for a project looking at ecology, which I ran from up to 2009. And then after retiring, after a few years, we realized that actually nothing much was happening about investigating the cause of lesser spot decline. And so in 2015, Linda and I created a thing called Woodpecker Network, specifically to encourage more study of lesser spots. So the starting point for Woodpecker Network was is all summed up in this table, really. This is all the data on breeding success of lesser spotted woodpeckers that was around after the RSPB studies. So it's a really difficult species to study. One reason that the RSPB studies stopped when it did was it actually was difficult and quite expensive to employ contractors to do fieldwork on lesser spots for not finding many nests or anything for the cost of that fieldwork. So it became very difficult to sustain. In Europe, there's only been 3 or 4 studies of lesser spots at all. The top one was the Swedes, a couple of guys, Ola Olsson and Ulf Victander, were brave enough to choose to do their PhD on lesser spots, which was amazing. It did take them 10 years to get their PhDs, but there you go, but they did it. and they found 120 nests or so. Kirsten Honch and Emma Rosmanith in Germany did their PhDs a bit more quickly and only found 30 nests. And then the late David Glue, whilst he was still at the BTO, summarised all the BTO nest records up until the 1990s. And you can see from those top studies that, in general, the lesser spots were fledging about 3.5 young per nesting attempt. And that seems to be what they need for a surviving population. And then you go down the bottom there to things in the dark green. Those are my data from the Hertfordshire woods, most of which no longer have lesser spots, and some of the early data from the RSPB, with the breeding success about half of what it needed to be. And one of the big drivers was the nest survival. The nests weren't making it through. So that's where we were when we created Woodpecker Network. And various things happened. I developed quite a lot of expertise on woodpeckers in general, and we'd also developed video cameras for inspecting woodpecker nests. And I started this when video cameras first came out, so it was real chunky stuff when we started. But we ended up with a situation we're in now. This is one of our nest cameras, where you've got a minute camera in there. It's one from a mobile phone, in effect, with LED illumination, so you can illuminate the nesting cavity. And in the box here, we've got a Bluetooth network, and so you can put this into a woodpecker hole at the top of a tree and look on your mobile phone or your iPad at the images. And these are the sort of images we can now get from Lesser Spotted Woodpecker nests. These are 3 young, 2 males and 1 female. Even in the nest, the males actually get their red heads before they fledge, which is fascinating compared with great spots. And this just gives you an idea. We buy these window cleaner poles, quite pricey, but actually really good and definitely worth the money. Here's me in garden when we moved to Sussex, trying to look nonchalant, and there's the camera up the pole. So we can get up to nests at 15 or 16 meters with these cameras. That's a Hertfordshire nest and broken off ash. Here's me again looking nonchalant. The nest is up here somewhere. And you couldn't possibly get this nesting information without these cameras. So it really has moved things on. And a photographer friend of ours took these for us. This is the inside of a Lesser Spotted Woodpecker nest. So they make a cavity, just like great spots and greens, but the cavity is only about 6 to 8 inches down in the tree, and quite a small diameter, only about, make sure you can see, only about that sort of size. You'll see, I'm not sure I've got an image of an adult in the nest, but they only just fit in. There's no insulation in these cavities whatsoever. It's just wood chips on the base. The hole is only about 1 inch, bit like a blue tip nest box hole, a really small hole to get in the cavity. And what we've got here is 4 eggs, and these have just hatched, and you can see here that the hatched eggs have split across the middle. That's how the young get out with their egg tooth. And you've got 3 young here, one there, and one down here. Totally blind, dark eyes, not able to control their own temperatures, and brooding the whole time. Minute things that turns out, we think that this is actually a critical period. So there's the 3 young. 5 days later, they've grown a lot, as you can see. There's still only 3 of them. There's the head there, still blind, another head there, head there. By the time it gets to 10 days, these were down to 2. They're just growing their feathers, and they leave the nest after about 20 days. They spend that last 10 days growing feathers, really. Their mass is probably up to almost fledging mass within the first 10 days. So our aim was to facilitate study nests and submit the data to Rare Breeding Bird Panel and the BTO Nest Record Scheme. What I've done on this graph is to plot the number of nests reported to the BTO every year from 83 onwards, and it kind of bumbles along at about 5 per year. There's a big peak in 2007 when RSPB started doing research on them. That then dropped off again, and then the red lines are the nests that have been found as part of Woodpecker Network, all by volunteers. So this is entirely volunteer-based approach. It's enthusiastic people in different areas of the country who really get into the lesser spots and get to know them well enough to find the nests. And so 2025 was a record year where we had data from 24 nests. So we've now actually got a pretty decent sample to start understanding what's going on. So where are the nests? So the big map there is where they are. That more or less covers the distribution of breeding lesser spots in Britain. Big gap in Wales, you'll note, but when you look at the counties there on the left, we have had a record from one nest in Essex. I guess a lot of you know where it was, but I won't say in the talk, just in case. And Chris Tyas, who ex-RSPB colleague, has kept me in touch a bit with what's been going on with lesser spot records in Essex. And there are regular records from the regular sites. There are still birds around in Essex, and it's not actually certain whether they're declining. I think they're probably holding their own, but at very low numbers. But looking at this list of where all the nests come from, we've monitored 172 nests since we started. That's in 11 years. So that really is a good sample. Most nests are in Hampshire here. Big blob in the New Forest. I'll show you the map of a distribution of lesser spots in the forest later. But it is the hotspot, probably about 10 to 15% of the British population in the New Forest. The other sites with the larger numbers are probably where we've got enthusiastic people. Devon, so Gus Robin coordinates Lesser Spotted Woodpecker in the southwest. So Devon, and down here Somerset has quite a few, 14 and 10. So there's a lot in there. Kent has some enthusiasts. Norfolk, we have Matt Shaw and Keith Billerstone doing work there. Sussex is us. So there's definitely a bias in this to where the people are looking and where they're working. And this is what we found in 2025. And we had 11 nests in Hampshire, all in the New Forest. And 9 of those were found by Rob Clements, who's fantastic now at finding lesser spot nests. And yeah, if you want to see lesser spot reliably, go and take a couple of days holiday in March, and you're pretty much guaranteed to see them in the forest. Going back to nest sites, did a lot on this, and there's a big contrast between lesser and great spots. So what I've done here is divide the nests, over 1,000 great spot nests that I found in Hertfordshire. At the time when I did this slide, 120 something lesser spot nests. So everybody says, oh, woodpeckers nest in dead trees. Well, sort of. So in fact, great spots, more than half of the nests are in live trees and live sites. So that's this green bar here, just over 50%. And they will excavate a cavity in what appears to be, what is a live oak tree. Often the oak trees that they choose have got heart rocks, so the woodpeckers break through into that and make the cavity. But half the nests in live trees, 35% in dead, and then some of them on dead bits of live trees. If you contrast that with lesser spot, 60% dead trees, and more or less all the rest on dead sites in live trees. So they invariably make their nest cavities in dead wood. And that, I think, is because they need a softer substrate to make their nests. And if you look at the nest trees they're using, so this is 166 or 172 nests we found on Woodpecker Network, and it's alder, birch, poplar, so quite a lot of the what I call pioneer species, softer trees. A few in oaks, not that many. Not many in fruit trees. orchards used to be I almost said plum, prime site for lesser spotted woodpecker nests, but we haven't been finding very many so far. I think there probably still are some in orchards in Herefordshire and places, but we're not hearing about them. Poplars here, and 70% of these nests are in dead trees, which more or less matches that data I showed you just now, in the live trees, but all of the sites are actually in dead bits of trees, so it's always dead. And you can see the differences. So in beech trees, for instance, they will often, particularly in New Forest, find a dead limb right in the top of one of the big old beech trees in the forest and nest in that. So they're in a live tree, but in a dead bit of it. And a birch and alder, it's usually a dead tree. So that's the sort of nest sites. And we did a paper in British Wildlife in 2 years ago now, 24, summarising what we knew about lesser spots. And for that, we pulled together the data from the BTO and our woodpecker network on the nest types of nest trees used each decade from the pre-70s through to 2020s. And that's what I've done on this here. And the blue lines here are what I call forest species, the oaks and the ashes, and the beech, the big mature forest trees. So the proportions sort of stayed the same. Here is what I call pioneer species. So these are the birch and alder, the species associated with wet woodland and new woodland. And that was bumbling along. Big increase now. Some of that could be our bias, but I think some of it's real as well, that there's more nests in those sort of sites. A couple of other interesting things here. The green bars are fruit trees. Now, for some reason in the 80s, none were found in fruit trees, or maybe one is there, but not very many. But now, hardly any nests in fruit trees at all. So using old orchards has disappeared. And the blue line here is the nests in elm trees. So they did nest in these dead elms during and after the Dutch elm disease period. And amazingly, some of these elms persisted in the landscape right to the 2000s and were still used. But that's now stopped. And the purple is poplars, and this is invariably hybrid poplar plantations. Lots of those were planted after World War II for the matchstick industry, and they've mainly gone. A lot of them are very old, and these nests are invariably in the dead limbs right in the top of these poplars, and often in the dead poplars. So big shifts in the sort of habitat that the sort of nests that they've been using. Right, I said at the beginning the starting point was low breeding success, where we analysed all the records from the BTO and Woodpecker Network back in 2000, and said, yeah, there really is a trend. So this is the number of young fledged per nest versus year, and 7 or so back there, quite high numbers through the 50s and 60s, and then this cloud of points here is where we get going with the Woodpecker Network and have far more nests in the sample. But this downward trend is statistically significant, allowing for all the things you have to allow for. So that is really confirming that low breeding success is the sort of proximate cause of the decline, but maybe you then have to think about why the breeding success is so low to get the ultimate cause. So I said we have got some good news. Well, here's the first bit of good news. So it turns out that 2025 was the best breeding season we've ever had for these lesser spots. We monitored 24 nests. We had no nest failures whatsoever, and they fledged up to 6 young. Gus Robin had a nest in Somerset, 6 young, which was amazing. But no failures is the main thing. So the average number fledged was about 3.8 young per nest, which more or less matches what they used to do and what they were doing on the continent. And that's the sort of productivity that they should be having. Why was it so good in 2025? Well, I think it's really interesting. I think the spring was characterized by incredibly stable weather, like no rain and no storm events. and often the woodpecker failures and loss of young are associated with wet weather and storms and things like that. Ultimately, I think the low breeding success is related to food and food supply for the chicks. And if the weather's bad, it exacerbates what might be going on with poor food supply. The other thing we found in 2025 is the birds did switch to feeding on aphids. They ought to be called the aphid woodpecker, and I'll say a bit more about that later, but they switched to feeding on aphids, and in previous years when they've done that, it's taken them like 20 minutes to come back to the nest with food. This year they were coming back with beakfuls of aphids in 5 minutes. Sorry, it's last year, 2025, every 5 minutes. So there must have been loads and loads of aphids on the trees in the woods, again related back to those weather conditions. And just to give you a thought of how all this works out, I've just compared the overall breeding parameters, if you like, for great spots, which are doing very well, and lesser spots, to show you where the big differences are. So they both lay a clutch of about 5 eggs, maximum 8 and minimum 3, that sort of range. Lesser spots slightly lower than great spots. And the nest survival now is sort of similar. Great spots, about 86-90% of the nests survive, which is very high if you compare that with a blackbird that might have a 20 or 30% nest survival, and that's very high, and that's because they nest in cavities and they're protected. The lessers aren't much lower now, so that very first table I showed you showed Hertfordshire and RSPB studies only having a 50% nest survival, but actually we're not finding that nests are totally failing at the moment. They've still got quite a good survival rate. But the big difference is the number of young that make it through to fledging. So with great spots, for the nests that are successful, about 4 of those 5 young make it through to leave the nest. For lessers, it's only about 3. So you combine those figures, you've got the nest survival and the number of nests young from successful nests. Great spots are overall producing about 3.8, and lessers in the 11 years we've been studying them are doing about 2.4. And 2.4 is not enough. And the main cause seems to be loss of chicks. And we think it's actually down to food supply and starvation of chicks. And I showed you that cavity right at the beginning, with the eggs just laid on the wood chips, and then the small young just laid there. It seems that one of the critical periods is when the young are very small, and the adults have to be able to feed enough and be able to continuously brood the young to keep them alive in that period. Because once young birds get cold, they don't beg for food anymore and they don't get fed. That's what happens. So let's kind of dig a bit deeper into what's going on. Again, using all the nest record data and our data, you can plot the first egg date of lesser spots. That's what the black thing is here. And surprise, surprise, we all know about climate change and warmer springs. They're nesting earlier each year, and the nesting is coming forward. And the red symbols on there were the first egg dates for 2025. And 2025 was one of the warmest springs we've ever had, and the whole year now turns out to be the warmest ever. But you can see from the first egg dates there that we had a lot of early nests, and so the birds laid earlier to try and keep up. The red line on there, I think is fascinating. That's the first egg dates for great spotted woodpeckers over those years, and that's when I was studying them in Hertfordshire. And when I first spotted that lesser spots were laying later, I thought, that's the problem. They're late. They're missing the caterpillars, missing the food in spring. It turns out they're late, and they always have been. And if you go and look at the literature, you realise that throughout its range, the lesser spot is a late nesting bird and a late nesting woodpecker. what I've done here is actually extract data from Białowieża forest in Poland, this primeval forest on the Polish-Belarus border. Studied intensively for many decades. This Thomas Wesolowski here was one of the leading lights, died 2 or 3 years ago, sadly. But he produced a paper on the laying dates of all the woodpecker species in that primeval forest. And I've ranked them there by how early they are. So the white-backed woodpecker, which feeds entirely on dead wood grubs and things, is the earliest. First egg dates April the 8th. Middle spot and great spot about the same. But then you've got lesser spot and three-toed, both about a week later than the great spot. So it does seem that this late nesting in lesser spots is adaptive. And our thoughts at the moment is that's related to having a good food supply around when the chicks first hatch and when the adults are having to keep them warm and doing a lot of toing and froing. In every year, always, and this applies to most species, early nesting birds do better than late. That seems to be general for most woodland species. But it does seem this late nesting in lesser spots is actually adaptive. And I couldn't resist putting this quote from Thomas in here saying, you know, the lack of data on types of food used and their seasonal variation limits how much you can understand how birds are going to respond in a warming world. And he's dead right there. You really have to understand what the birds are eating and what that's doing to work out the consequences. So we're going to do a bit more of that. So many woodland birds feed their young on defoliating caterpillars. I'm sure you've all seen the accounts of this. Blue tits, great tits. And here we've got a couple of pictures with a great spot bringing green caterpillars to its young, and the lesser doing the same. And there's a lot of discussion about the way this behavior has evolved and whether the match between the birds and the caterpillars is actually going to be retained as climate change. This thing called phenological mismatch, which is quoted all over the place. And the idea of that is that the caterpillars are going to be more responsive to changes in spring temperatures and get earlier as the springs get warmer, but the birds are more constrained and they can't keep up, and so they end up being out of phase with their food supply. And so what we've been doing for the last, I've been doing it for the last 2 decades, is measuring caterpillar poo. It's amazing what you get involved with, but it's turned out to actually be a really fantastic thing to have done. So these are defoliating caterpillars. I'm sure some of you who've been in oak woods in spring will have noticed there can be a rain of caterpillar poo coming from the leaves. The whole bunch of caterpillars that have evolved to feed on oak leaves when they first open. And this here on the left is actually a well-nibbled oak leaf. And in fact, the oak trees have an adaptation. They can grow a new set of leaves after spring if many of them get taken away. And a couple of species, this is the mottled umber Aranus defoliaria in Latin, so there's a clue in the name. And this is green oak tortrix, and this is some of the caterpillar droppings that I've been looking at extensively. And here we are, here's Linda with one of our famous now, caterpillar frastrays. So we now operate these all over the place. We've got volunteers running them in Nottinghamshire, Lancashire, Gloucestershire, Sussex, Hertfordshire, and Devon. And here we are, here's some caterpillar poo. Looks a bit like tea leaves, really, dried cylindrical stuff. So these trays sit there in the woods, the caterpillars are pooing, poo drops into the tray. We change the trays every few days, dry them, look under the microscope, sort out the poo. And from that, you can get a measure of the abundance of the caterpillars and their timing, which is really important. And it turns out, as you'd expect, the caterpillars are interesting as well. So the caterpillars come out earlier in warm springs. So this is average April, May temperature. They're getting earlier and earlier, and there's a gradient on this. And the other thing that happens with these caterpillars is that they're not there every year. they undergo long-term cycles. This is actually data from one of the Hertfordshire woods, which has gone through, I think that's an 11-year cycle. Big peak in 2007-8, and again in 2019-20. And it's well known, it occurs in Wytham Woods, where the classic great studies are gone. But these defoliating oak caterpillars go through long-term cycles. And nobody really knows why, but it's probably to do with parasitic wasps that lay their eggs in the caterpillars, and they cause the whole population to cycle. And the variation in abundance is enormous. It's like a factor of 500 between good years of caterpillars and no caterpillars. So that's massive. And the other feature of it is that it's not synchronized over the whole country. Individual woods have their own cycles. So you don't pick it up into the national population trends. It varies between woods. Now, this is a bit busy, this slide, but I'll try to explain what's on it. This is great spotted woodpeckers, and this is a Hertfordshire woods where we were measuring the frass, and we had all the breeding parameters for great spots, just to show you what goes on. So the black blobs along the top here is when they laid their eggs. So this is the first egg dates of the great spots, and the arrow there is the predicted time of peak food demand for great spots, which is when the young are 10 days old. That's when they really demand the food. And then the lines here are the peak of the caterpillar frass in each spring. And we've got springs going from 2008 to 16 when we left the county. And there's various things to see. When you look at the lay dates, they vary from year to year, but not very much. And so the birds aren't varying their lay dates in relation to temperature as much as the caterpillars are. And you can see that the caterpillar peaks vary a lot, and the timing of the peak food demand is varying in relation to the caterpillars massively. So in some years like this, caterpillars have been and gone before the main peak food supply, and ones like this, the caterpillars are not even arrived. So that's a really cold spring. The woodpeckers started nesting, they've got the young, they've got to feed them, but the caterpillars haven't kept up. So it's a big variation. And the other big feature is in this, the amount of frass goes from 6 on that scale at the start down to 0.04 at the end. So that is something like, what is that, a 500 times difference in the abundance of food to feed your young. And we published on this and analysed it, and it turned out even for great spotted woodpecker that have all sorts of other ways of feeding, the abundance and the timing of the caterpillars had a big effect on their productivity. And in general, this mismatch is getting more. So if you look at the great spots here, I've just pulled together to say, well, how well synchronized were the great spots in the 1980s? And here we are, this is zero mismatch. So the caterpillar peak is matching the peak food demand of the young. And in the 80s, it was about 1 day wrong, really, but it really overlapped. So on average, they were pretty well matched. So that's evolution in action. We've now changed the rules by making springs warmer. And in 2010, most of the years are mismatched by quite a lot. A few are managing to match. And I'm sure if I did the same thing now for the 20s, it would be totally mismatched. So even for great spots, this mismatch is increasing. Right, back to lesser spots. I apologise for this graph, it's so blurred. I nicked it from the paper because I didn't want to pay $30 to the publisher to buy a copy of this paper. But this is lesser spot nestling diet from the German PhD study. And along here is time, so early nests through to late. And this is the fraction of different types of prey that are being brought to the nest. And the caterpillars are here, and they fall right off. At the same time, the triangles are aphids, and they increase. And this is why I think the lesser spotted woodpecker ought to be renamed the aphid woodpecker. They really are dependent on aphids from trees for feeding their young later on. So they've been forced to nest a bit late because they need to be able to feed the very small young. Once they're getting bigger, they need aphids. And by chart, this is complete serendipity. We had a paper published in British Birds on lesser spot population estimates, and the editor chose the cover. And this is a lesser spot actually in Poland, collecting food for its young, because you can see in the beak there, it's collecting the stuff, and it's feeding on aphids. That looks like some sort of cherry to me. Botanists in the audience might be able to tell me what it is, but that just shows aphids are really important. And what we've done this year, and a little bit the year before, last year, I keep still muddled my years, is we've invited some trusted photographers to actually get some really good quality images from lesser spot nests, and they undertake to let us use the images for scientific purposes. And this is 2025. This is the one nest, and this is through the nesting cycle. And here's the lesser spot bringing caterpillars to the young of various colours, the grub there. And right at the end there, at the end of the nesting cycle, is pure aphids. We have the data on the nesting and the timing of the caterpillars in last year, and you can see that the lesser spots were behind by about 10 days. But they're still able to do okay because there are a lot of aphids around. So that's where we are on the ecology, and there's actually a proposal being put together for Natural England funding for a big project on how we can manipulate these other, the aphid food supply as well as the caterpillars. And there's a lot of suggestions that it's actually related to wet woodland. So most of our lesser spot nests are actually in wet and damp woodlands, and we think actually they might have a more diverse invertebrate food supply that lasts longer through the season to improve the breeding success. So that's where we got on the ecology. The other thing we've got up to in the last couple of years is to actually get into acoustic monitoring. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware of what's going on, that you can actually record bird sounds now and identify them. I guess a lot of you have got Merlin on your phone apps and know how fantastic it is. And it's fascinating because the bat people have been using acoustic monitoring for ultrasonics for bats for years. And the technology has gradually got better and better for the bat detectors. And of course, they were forced to do it because the bats only emit ultrasound and we can't hear it unless you're a very small child, can't hear it at all. So they use various devices for visualizing the ultrasonic calls. Now, the early ones just converted the frequency so you could hear it, so they made funny squeaks, which were an artifact of the device rather than the bats. Coming on to the later ones that record all the whole sound wave. And in birds, in fact, the bird people have been kind of slow to catch up. So the Cornell lab in the States have Merlin, which is around the world, which is fantastic. Nocturnal migration people have been using acoustics for quite a long time. And the BTO, following on from some of their work with devising bat systems, are now devising systems for birds as well. And I thought a few years ago this might be an answer for the difficulty in surveying lesser spots. And so we got a hold of a recorder and we went to the New Forest in 2024 and put out recorders right through the lesser spot breeding season just to see how good they would be. And one of the aims of it was actually to collect recordings so we could work with the BTO to build some classifiers, just like the Merlin classifier, but specific classifiers for species like the spotted woodpecker and hawfinch that are really tricky for birders to pick up on their sound. It's got to be pretty hot. So we did this in the New Forest. We had a wildlife acoustic song meter operating from dawn to dusk, 9 sites through the forest, running from, in fact, we started in February, And I was then faced with many, many hours of recordings. And at that stage, we didn't have any classifier to identify the lesser spot. So I went through by eye using some free software called Audacity, which some of you may know about. It's really developed for the music industry, but allows you to manipulate sounds. And this is a sound spectrogram. So frequency is at the side, time along the bottom, and the color represents where the energy is. And you get different patterns. And this is from the New Forest. And this is a cacophony of noise. You've got wrens, blackbirds, great tits, crows. Along here, these bleeps, that's all firecrest. Firecrests are really good on these systems, easy to pick up. And what you've got here is actually a lesser spot call. That's a call like the kestrel call. And after a few days of doing this, I got quite good at spotting the things on the spectrograms. And these here are the lesser spot drums. I'm not going to try and play them because it always goes wrong, the technology. So lesser spot drums all the way through. So it worked really well. We were able to supply the recordings to the BTO, so there is now a woodpecker classifier available to us anyway. But we're also able to write it up and look at the detectability. And we know that lesser spots are hard to find. And when you look at the data from these sound recorders, you realize why. Sound recorders picked up lesser spots at every place you put them in the forest, but they only did it for about 5 minutes in a 5-day period. So if you're a bird watcher going into a wood searching for a lesser spot, the chances of you and the lesser spot making a noise in the same place at the same time is quite low. And we plotted it here. All this was published in a paper in British Birds that came out just before Christmas. But this shows that actually the season for detecting lesser spots starts in mid-February if the weather's good. And by the end of April, forget it, they've gone totally silent. And of course, a lot of people don't get going on spring bird watching till April. So these birds are over and done with before most people get out. And they're more likely to be detected at first light. This is minutes since sunrise, so it falls right off during the day. So nice weather, good mornings in March is the best time to detect them, and early in the morning. So armed with the stuff from the New Forest in 24, we got some recorders in Hampshire and Sussex to see what we could find. And this is from Hampshire. So in Hampshire, we actually did a lesser spotted woodpecker survey using conventional methods in 2022. And these were people going out to all the 1K squares that had had lesser spots in the previous 10 years. And these dots are where they all went. The yellow dots, they didn't find any lesser spots. And the red dots, this is a New Forest, 300 plus pairs in the New Forest, fantastic. Elsewhere in Hampshire, very few, and we thought maybe 17 pairs in the whole county. So last year we stuck some recorders out, and this is what happened. So we found them in another 10 sites where they hadn't been found at all with observers. And Sussex was even better. We put recorders out and found lesser spots in over 60, 70% of all the sites where we put recorders. Now we chose wet woodland, so it wasn't random sites. So this acoustic monitoring is just fantastic. And so at the moment, we're about to do more formalized surveys in Sussex and Hampshire, and there are recorders going to be used all over the place. I think that's on the next slide. But the aim for Sussex and Hampshire is to try and get county population estimates of how many there are. And Hampshire, we know there are 300 in the forest, so we've ticked that. There could well be 50 territories outside the New Forest. In Sussex, I don't know. It could easily be 100 territories in the county. So the plans: organised survey in Sussex, support deployment all over the place. In Somerset and Devon, Gus Robin is coordinating it. The bird clubs down there have purchased recorders, and they're all set to go. I've just heard this week that Dorset have got together and a gang of them have got recorders and they have a go. Kent actually did a lesser spot survey last year using recorders and observers, and are now going to go back to a lot of places with recorders to supplement that. In Herefordshire, in Wales, we've got a volunteer, Stu Keenor, who's fantastic, and he's just going to change the lesser spot story in Wales, I think, in the next year. So that's all happening. The Woodpecker network, the Woodpecker module on the BTO acoustic pipeline will be available to launch. At the moment, I'm busily marking up recordings that were false positives this year, so the automatic system could be trained on the false positives to make it better at detecting lesser spots and not coming up with the false ones. So that will be available, and that's really important. Although it sometimes gets it wrong, it actually points you to the right place in many, many hours of sound recordings as to where the lesser spots might be making a noise. And then on top of that, the RSPB, BTO and Natural England are working up a proposal for a national survey just in the lead up to the Atlas. So there's a lot of talk about the next BTO breeding bird Atlas, and these sort of acoustic methods are one of the things that are going to be used to try and improve the recording of some of the more difficult to detect species, and lesser spots right up there with those. And that leads me to thank the people that do most of the work. So here's a whole gang of Woodpecker Network volunteers. That's Linda, my wife, Rob Clements, the famous Nine Nest Rob, Stu and Tara from the New Forest. Holly was in the New Forest working for RSCB. You may know Matt Shaw, Norfolk guy who's been finding them there in Norfolk. These three are looking very pleased with themselves. This is Gus Robin in the middle, who does lesser spots in the southwest, and Ed Horncastle and Stu Keener for Wales. And one thing on Gus's initiative this year, we actually commissioned some lesser spotted woodpecker pin badges, which are very exclusive. We're not letting anybody else sell them yet. So anybody who finds a nest or leads us to a nest gets awarded a pin badge. And so they're looking pleased with themselves because they've just got their pin badges, as have them, and they've got pin badges now, and I get one anyway because I run it. But there we are. That's Lesser Spot story. I think it really has moved on a lot in the last few years. We're far more positive about lesser spots. I think having a monitoring system that can work is one of the keys to the next conservation steps, because you're in a position to actually measure the effect of what you're up to. Whereas before, it was really tricky to even find the birds, let alone monitor them properly. So I think we're in a really good position. If you ever find a lesser spot, get in touch and tell us about it. I really still am hopeful that you're going to get more nests in Essex. We kind of know where they are, and they've just got to be found by the right people at the right time. Any records of lesser spots that we get sent are totally confidential to the observer. They don't go any further, and that's a key to Woodpecker Network, really, to build the trust of observers. And I think in the last 11 years, we've actually made quite a lot of progress. So that's it for me, folks. If there are any questions, fire away.
Fascinating, Ken. Thanks very much. Yeah, we've got a few questions that have come in. We've had a lot of people watching this evening. This has been something that's really piqued interest in our birders, and not just our own, because we've got one viewer who admits that he lives up near Manchester and he hasn't seen a lesser spot for nearly 20 years. So hopefully this has helped you explain to him why. So a couple of questions. One. Do lesser spotted woodpeckers insist on excavating their own nest cavities in dead trees, or will they take to man-made holes in suitable habitat or even nest boxes?
They won't go to nest boxes at all. They always excavate a cavity, and I think we've only had one case in 170 nests of a reuse of a cavity.
Wow.
So they make a new cavity each year. they often end up excavating 2 or more cavities. The record is them finally using the 3rd one, which is incredibly frustrating for the observers, because you think you've got it all sussed and you know where they're nesting, and you go back a week later and nothing's happened, and they've just moved 20 meters away or something. And we think that might be related to predation avoidance.
Right.
If a predator shows signs of finding that hole, they'll go to another one. So quite a lot of pressure like that.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Do lesser spots compete with and lose out to the larger greater spots or any other species with regard to nesting sites and food resource?
Right, nest sites first.
Yeah.
So yes, they do sometimes lose the nest site to great spots, and they are sometimes actually predated, the young taken by great spots, particularly in years when there aren't many caterpillars and the weather's bad and the great spots themselves are struggling for food. And that's when great spots will switch to attacking blue tits, great tits, and everything else. But the key thing about it is, yes, it happens, but the overriding cause of low productivity is the chick starvation. It's food, really. Yes, great spots aren't positive, but they're not the main driver of this low productivity. A few years ago, there was a big thing about, great spots are increasing, lesser spots are decreasing, the two must be connected. I don't think they are. So if you go back to those distribution maps, the places that have the highest density of great spots are the same places that still have lesser spots. And there's some published information from the Netherlands from their common bird monitoring, showing both great spots and lesser spots going up in the Netherlands. And it's to do with the woodland habitat as much as anything. So great spots aren't good news, but they're not as bad as everybody would make out.
Okay, thank you. So we've then got a Mark Nowers from the RSPB says, fabulous, Ken, thanks very much. Do you think ash dieback and acute oak decline will be akin to Dutch elm disease in their positive effect?
Yeah. Oh, hi, Mark. Great you're there. We've been keeping watch on ash dieback, and the jury is still out. So we've seen less spots foraging on dead ash, and we have them nesting in ash. Quite often you saw from that table quite a lot of nests in ash. The only thing about ash is that when it dies, the bark remains very strongly attached, whereas when the elm trees died, the bark kind of fell off, and you could see that getting at the bark beetles underneath was very easy. I think it's a bit harder. We've actually sampled some dying ash, and in fact there's loads of ash bark beetles that infest this dying ash. And in fact there's 3 species of ash bark beetle, there's only 1 species of elm bark beetle. And they use different bits of the ash tree, and they can be at enormous densities. So the food supply there is there. Maybe we're seeing an effect, but we're not. It's not a massive one yet.
Okay.
It could kick through in the end. And what was the other one? Acute oak decline. Yeah, I think acute oak decline would have helped great spots more than lessers.
Right.
I don't know. Let's explain what it is to people. It's when the mature oaks suddenly start to look sick and they get black stains on the trunk, and there are patches of dying crown in them. And the immediate cause is some bacterium that they get, but it's actually related to stress. It's when the oak trees are actually suffering from stress from drought or overcrowding that this tends to happen. And I didn't include it in this talk because I only had an hour. But when you look at the foraging sites for great spots, They forage on large diameter dead branches, and those are the sort of things that are left on oaks with oak decline. The small branches that the lesser spots will feed on just fall off. So you could see it might benefit great spots more than lessers.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Observation here from one of our members is the last Essex bird report, so that's the 2023 version, gave the lesser spot status as a scarce resident with 89 records from 32 locations. He says, however, doubtless it's under-recorded. And you and I were talking about how difficult they are to find and see, even when you think you know where they are.
Yeah, I think they're still there. So I did wonder, with places like Essex, whether they're declining, and we don't really know now whether lesser spots are still declining in the places they still are. And somewhere like Essex, where there are still a few, they wouldn't still be there if they weren't breeding and producing young. They would have disappeared. So I think they're still kind of hanging on. If you did get going with some recorders, I think you might find them in other places as well. Because there's a lot of suitable woodland, in various bits of the county. And when you get around the south or around the M25 there, where we've had records, and other places too. So I think they're still around.
I'm just checking the questions. There's no further questions coming through. A number of people thanking you for a very interesting and informative talk. I think we'll wrap this one up then from a perspective of questions coming in then, Ken.
Okay.
So I'll just thanks everybody for attending. Hope you really enjoyed it this evening, and we look forward to seeing you on our next session.
Okay, cheers everyone. Thanks for listening.